Welcome. We are going to wait for a couple more people to join the event before we start. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome you all to the first event in our series, which is covering One Day Sooner's latest research project, which Mabel here is the researcher on, I'll say. Today we'll be covering the main points you'll find in the report, which is titled Something Truly Epic in the Era of the Virus, A History of COVID-19 Human Challenge Studies. And we will expand upon those ideas in further events, which we hope you will also join us for. I won't talk too much about the report. I will definitely get things wrong, and we have the expert here with us. So we're very excited to welcome our speaker and the project researcher, Mabel. Most of you probably know her. And I'll just read her bio off just so you can learn a little bit more. Mabel Rosenheck is a public historian and independent scholar. She completed her PhD in cultural studies at Northwestern University in 2016. Since then, she has written and lectured in both academic and mainstream outlets. She has also worked with One Day Sooner organizing and moderating a series of scholarly roundtables on vaccine equity, which I loved working with her on. Some logistical points: the chat will be open during the event, so please feel free to ask questions during and throughout. If you also have a question and you'd like to ask that via audio, just raise your hand and we will unmute you, and you can feel free to do so. Mabel let me know that it's okay to do that throughout the talk if you'd like. And with that, Mabel, I'll give you the floor to talk about your work, and excited to start.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be, like mostly One Day Sooner people, probably a few people more filtering in. So I'm happy to do this kind of classroom style where I'll talk. If you guys have questions, again, feel free to throw them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hands, and we can sort of stop if there are questions as we go. We can see how that works. Maybe that'll be a good approach. So as Danny said, I worked on this research project about sort of documenting human challenge studies, documenting all of the efforts to run human challenge studies for COVID-19. Sort of, partly that's, some institutions have done that, historically, collecting information, documenting their largest projects. Also, there's more and more interest in, oral history interviewing and sort of rapid collecting. So documenting what happens, as things are going on. So if you pay attention to local museums and places around you, they may be doing projects like that. Or at least they were doing them at the beginning of the pandemic. I imagine some of that energy has faded a little bit. And then there's also this move, I think, towards writing sort of histories of the present, which is also part of what this project is. And that's to sort of introduce myself as a historian and why I'm writing about something that happened, or still is happening in some cases, in terms of the British challenge studies. And so when Josh and I sort of organized this project and started working on it, part of the task was just laying out sort of what happened, laying out the timeline as carefully as possible, looking at, just laying it out, writing a narrative, who were the parties involved, what were the moves that they made, what were the key, pivotal moments and all of that kind of stuff. Part of it, again, was documentation, was gathering all of that information, as close to the time of when it happened as possible. Another part of that was I conducted, a series of interviews with people who were involved in various ways, some of whom I'm sure I'll talk about this evening. And so the biggest question was sort of how were decisions made? I think that was the biggest question from the One Day Sooner perspective. I'll talk about this a little bit further on, thinking about, there was this ethical debate, and then there were these questions about sort of feasibility, questions about how to actually make this happen. And there was a bit more interest on Josh's part in the questions about how decisions were made, and particularly about the preparations around challenge studies, rather than sort of focusing on the ethical debate. So of course, that ended up being part of the research. And so inevitably, we're sort of going to come to this question of why were challenge studies run or not run, particularly, again, from the One Day Sooner side of things. That's a lot of the interest. And I'll just caution to say, that to some extent, we can never get at those kinds of questions, at those questions of intention. That's sort of one of the pitfalls of interviews. What people say isn't always the whole picture. No one has the biggest of pictures. So of course, I'm trying to get at that in my research. But we should be cautious about looking for sort of intentions, and certainly cautious about looking for simple answers. We can't just blame challenge studies didn't happen because of Anthony Fauci, for instance. No one thing's ever going to explain it, and we're never going to get at that simple answer of why Fauci didn't support challenge studies, even if we were to interview him and he was to answer that question ostensibly. So what does explain some of this stuff? Obviously, I'm still trying to get at that question, trying to explore that question. And I'll talk about sort of 3 areas that I think I can get at and can sort of start to answer that question. There's the sort of context, the timeline of the pandemic. And so this is a lot of where my background as a historian comes from, thinking about how do we put sort of science or medicine or things like that in these larger contexts, both sort of epidemiological contexts, but also sort of social and even political contexts as well. For this, it'll be important to think about the fact that this idea emerged at a very specific moment. Of course, the testing went very quickly. There was a poor public health response, and then these vaccines, many of them turned out to be safe and effective. In fact, astonishingly effective. So there's this larger context that really influenced whether why challenge studies were proposed and then why they did or didn't happen. There's also this larger institutional context, which is a lot of the research that I'm publishing in the Monash Bioethics Review, which the manuscript is done. I don't think it's quite up online yet, but if you're interested in seeing that, I can always send it to you. And this is why sort of understanding individual intentions will only give us part of the picture, is because there's these institutions that operate on a different level and operate in different ways that make individual understandings only so useful. And again, this is where sort of this historical, social, cultural analysis becomes useful. We can intertwine sort of science with bioethics. And some of this comes from this sort of larger tradition of history of science and medicine and science and technology studies, thinking about larger discourses, the way that we talk about things and how that influences history and how we use that to study history. And then there's also this question. So there'll also be this somewhat more simple answer that I'll be looking at of why, really one of the key things to why challenge studies were and were not run has to do with the expected goals and the uses of the study. So that's just sort of something to keep in mind, I think, as I move through some of this history, is that the primary reason why people from the beginning thought challenge studies might be worthwhile was to speed the development of a first generation vaccine, right? So there were a lot of people who thought only if these tests could get those first vaccines quicker, that was the only use. And that was the main use that was proposed, in February and March and April. And then there were secondary uses of testing vaccines if there were obstacles to conventional trials. And then there were sort of tertiary uses of learning more about the virus with these longer term goals, which is, to spoil the ending, that's why the UK ended up running their trials and their studies, and nobody else did, was because they believed that that was still a valuable use for challenge studies. And so as we'll see, for various efforts, particularly the NIH and for Johnson & Johnson's efforts, only that immediate vaccine, only that use of those first generation vaccines is going to be worth the risks, both reputational and to the health of volunteers. Whereas the UK team sort of proceeded because they believed that there were other uses that were valuable. So now I'm going to walk you through some of this timeline, this historical context, and think back. I think in a lot of this, there were moments when I was thinking about this as history and sort of pulled back and was like, no, wait, like this was actually my life. This was our lives. Now coming up on sort of 2.5 years ago. So I think it's an important, valuable historical exercise to remember back to what things were like. Right? So in December of 2019 and January of 2020 was when this virus was emerging. In February and March already, even late January to some extent, there were some people, epidemiologists, Mark Lipsitch was one of them, who were seeing very quickly this is going to be bad. So when it's always interesting to me to think about what are the dates when this became real to different people. For me, I think it was March 11th. Tom Hanks has COVID, NBA is canceled. That was when my classes went online. But people were actually noticing that, sort of even earlier than that. And so this was clear to people, and that's when some people started thinking about challenge studies, really, as early as February, and then of course into March, April, and May. And one of the things I think is really important about this, and that struck me throughout the research, was how many different groups were thinking about this independently of one another, starting right around the same time. So Nir Eyal, Mark Lipsitch, and Peter Smith published their article at the end of March. They started writing at the beginning of March. I think it was around March 9th was the date that Nir gave me. But around the same time, late February, early March, there were, a lot of the other teams who may not have published till a little bit later were also starting their manuscripts. They were starting to have these conversations. And so that includes ethicists, that includes scientists, that includes, academics, as well as sort of industry. It includes folks at the WHO, and it includes some policy people who are starting to get involved in those conversations as well. And one of the important things, I say when this was particularly striking, that that multiple parties started thinking about this, at the same time and very early. And I think that's important also because it reminds us that there is a prehistory to COVID-19 challenge studies and to challenge studies in general. And I'm not talking about, Edward Jenner, testing smallpox vaccines in the late 18th century, but this more recent history of, in 2016, Anna Durbin proposed running challenge studies for Zika virus while there was an epidemic outbreak of that virus in Latin America and Brazil, I think it was. That idea was deemed crazy. A lot of people thought that was crazy, and the idea was rejected essentially by a panel of ethicists, one of whom was Seema Shah, who then went on to put together a team that did a very systematic analysis of what are the ethics of challenge studies, what are the circumstances under which these could be undertaken in a pandemic or epidemic situation, and really started to think through that. So some of the teams that we saw publish and speak on COVID-19 challenge studies were doing so in part because of some things that had happened, very recently. So there's the mainstreaming of challenge studies more broadly that's happened, in the last 20 years, more and more people are doing them. And what's followed that is more and more ethical considerations, more ethicists thinking about challenge studies. And then another layer on top of that becomes, when would challenge studies be acceptable in a pandemic and an epidemic situation? And the other important context of the prehistory, which I think is also pretty interesting, is that there was also this move in the 2000s, particularly after the Ebola crisis, of rethinking vaccine trials. I didn't spend a ton of time looking at those debates and those conversations, but the idea that if we have a vaccine that we're pretty sure is safe, that might work, should we just give it to everyone? Because if we don't, then it'll be harder to test it because the outbreaks might wane, harder to test just because vaccine testing is difficult. And so responding to that and sort of butchering some of those conversations, the ethical and scientific ones, but there were a lot of debates about how to do so because of the Ebola crisis, how to test vaccines. Are there better ways to do this, faster ways to do this that could still be safe and could still get us reliable data? So that's, I think, really, so I think it's important to think about, how many people were thinking about this in February, as early as February and March, and then sort of why they were thinking about that there's these two strands in particular of folks contexts in which people are starting to think more and more about the role of challenge studies and how they could be used, particularly in pandemic and epidemic circumstances. And then also, if you think back to February, March, April, May, we have to think about the pace of science and the expectations that there were about COVID vaccines. And this is something that I think is particularly, messy is not a bad word, is that there were a lot of different ideas going, floating around at that moment in time about how about what a vaccine would look like, what pace it might be developed at, about what kind of emergency use approval might happen, all of these different things. There were a lot of different ideas about how vaccines might be developed and how they might eventually end up in people's arms. Some of which I sorted through more than others, but there were just a lot of different ideas. There were a lot of fears about the pace that science might go. about how slow vaccine development traditionally goes. You may remember hearing that number. The fastest vaccine ever developed was for mumps, and that was in 4 years. And we get this trivia that, of course, doesn't necessarily actually have that much to do with the realities that we're facing now. And I can certainly talk more about some of that stuff, but these were obviously very different because of these platforms that had the mRNA and the adenovirus platforms that had never been used to develop an actual usable vaccine before. So the expectations were that things would be very slow. And the expectation also was that the public health response would not be disastrous. There were some expectations that we might actually have the virus under control by summer and fall when we were ready to test vaccines. And that would slow things down. And that would be a situation where challenge studies would be useful because they could be used when there wasn't enough virus circulating otherwise. Another thing to remember is the very idea of ending a pandemic with a vaccine was pretty much new. That's never really been done before. There's been vaccines for flu pandemics that have happened in 2009 and even earlier than that, but it was never really a vaccine that ended those pandemics. And of course, probably not a vaccine that's going to end this one either, it seems like, but that sort of resolution to a pandemic and the use of vaccines in that was especially unknown back then. So, again, think back to what it was like in March. There was all this uncertainty, of course. And so there were calls for outside the box thinking. There were people searching for a different answer. This is why some people were turning to challenge studies. And I think it's also really important to say that I think in some ways challenge studies were kind of an easy way out. It seemed like this was going to be a shortcut and this could make things a lot easier. There's one article in particular, and the name of the author is escaping me, but he emphasizes the idea that vaccines are not vaccinations, as many public health folks do, and saying, okay, even if we had a vaccine 1 day sooner, a month sooner, a year sooner, relatively speaking, that having that vaccine is different from actually having it distributed, from having people take the vaccine, from having it distributed equitably, having it get to all the people that it needs to get to. So I think it's really important, especially for folks working in this advocacy space around challenge studies and around the speed of developing vaccines, to remember that there's a lot of other obstacles that I think are much harder to solve. It's a lot easier, in fact, to develop a vaccine, it seems, than it is to equitably distribute one when we live, in the system of capitalism that we live under, and we live in the particular political regime that we live under. So I think that's important things to keep in mind, especially again living in this medical research space, this particular policy space. And so these proposals, as I said, there were many of them, and they came from lots of different directions. So the first one, as I said, was Nir Eyal, Mark Lipsitch, and Peter Smith's article. Came out online on March 24th, I think was the date, was when the preprint came out. And importantly, there's some epidemiologists. So Nir Eyal is a philosopher, Lipsitch and Smith are both epidemiologists, but none of them are human challenge studies researchers. There were a lot of details that were sort of missing or glossed over in that article. Some were glossed over by the authors, some were glossed over by the press. And I think it fostered some optimism that may have been a little bit misplaced. And there was a lot of criticism that came back after that from people who were maybe too overly pessimistic, overly skeptical about the potential of a challenge study, who kind of dismissed the idea because so much of the hype, so much of the interest, I think, was contingent on this scenario that was made that again, I think was a little bit oversimplified. That said, promptly, and so I really do think that article really shaped the conversation in deep ways that nothing could quite moderate. So in beginning of May, in April and May, Art Kaplan and Stanley Plotkin came out with an article that was much more sort of even-handed about the potential obstacles, what it would take to develop a challenge study. And then the WHO had their ethics team, their recommendations came out in early May. Seema Shah's team, which also overlapped a lot with the WHO ethics team, they published their article at the beginning of May, as did Sal Galit and Jem Rosick. That team was also overlap with the WHO team, Seema Shah's team, and their article came out in I think the end of May was that one. So there's more coming out that are a little bit more fully considered, I think, that have a little bit more of the scientific expertise. Some of those are interdisciplinary teams. But this idea had really taken hold among certain people, I think among the press, among a lot of enthusiasts, that a challenge study could really save all of this time, really had all of this potential. And that, for obvious reasons, like that's a compelling story. We're all looking for compelling stories. And that may have set expectations higher than was realistic, I guess, is the word I'm looking for there. So then there were also, so this was some of this like academic discourse and some of the conversations going on in the press as well. There's also then, I think, another set of people who are thinking about this, who are the scientists who would actually run challenge studies. And I think it's important to set those groups off as a somewhat distinct group of people, some of whom were publishing in those other articles, but not all of them necessarily doing so. So Matt Memoli proposes the idea to folks at the NIH at the beginning of March. NIH didn't respond quickly to him. They start making public statements in May in the document that I think Danny shared as part of the invite that has the whole report. There's an appendix that shows you every public comment that folks that sort of officials made, including the ones by folks at the NIH, pretty much all of which were quite skeptical about the value of a challenge study and the ethics, whether they would end up being ethical. Around the same time, Mette Rostenberg at Leiden University Medical Center, it had occurred to her, she's a challenge study researcher, particularly with malaria and schistomiasis. The idea had occurred to her too. She kind of kept the idea to herself because she thought it was too controversial. Garth Rappaport at Imperial College and the UK Vaccine Task Force were starting to think about it that early. Adrian Hill at Oxford also sort of backed off a little bit at first, but his interest seemed to grow quickly as well. So again, lots of different people seeing that this is a possibility very quickly and considering it, to varying degrees. And also early on, pharmaceutical companies saw this as a possibility. I did not get to talk to anybody from a pharmaceutical company directly, so I don't know exactly how they got the idea, when they started thinking about it. Certainly Stanley Plotkin and Art Kaplan are to some extent tied into some of those people. It was never totally off the table, even for those folks. Some were more skeptical than others. Certainly, folks at Moderna were pretty skeptical. But even then, when you hear them speak publicly, which again you can see in that appendix, they all said, well, if we would look at it, if it was available, we would certainly look at it. And then there's these proposals, which I sort of mentioned already, is in the considerations particularly from One Day Sooner and particularly from volunteers. Those are latching on to particularly to the Ayala Lipsitch Smith article. And it's interesting to think about from a historical perspective, if I wasn't sort of having this research sponsored by One Day Sooner, if I hadn't gotten into this through One Day Sooner, how important would that effort be, and how would I view that effort in historical perspective is something that I really don't know, and would be very interesting to imagine myself, I guess, 100 years from now, walking into this. Where would I see the organization? I'm not sure. But I think and as I'll speak further as well, how big the effort was, because One Day Sooner did also try to actually develop a strain to run challenge studies. How important that effort was, where it'll appear in the historical record, I think is a very interesting question coming from being part of the organization. So then, of course, in parallel, vaccine development is happening. This conversation about challenge studies is happening, and vaccine development is happening, and it is going fast. It goes, far faster than anybody could have imagined, really basically anybody could have imagined. And again, really important to remember that the key use for the challenge studies, and this is, in that first article, and it was also, certainly at the forefront for folks at the NIH and Johnson & Johnson, the key use was speed. Any other secondary uses of challenge studies were just that. They were secondary, if not tertiary. Really, for them, the only reason to risk the health of volunteers was if this was really going to get a vaccine faster. And things were going very quickly. So even, Fauci predicts this 12 to 18 month timeline. at the end of February. So already things, he's predicting that this will go very fast. Some people were really skeptical of that. Other people thought it could go faster, which was the reason they were advocating for challenge studies. But I think, again, thinking back to that moment, what did we think? We thought that a vaccine might end this. How fast did we think it was going to go? Did we think that was impossible? And what would be the role of challenge studies amid those expectations is really important, sort of from a historical perspective. And so, of course, there are all these factors as to why it went quickly. There were the mRNA and the adenovirus platforms that were ready to go. All of the research that had been done on coronaviruses since SARS and MERS and the other related viruses over the last 20 years. Running studies in parallel was part of what made this go fast. And then there was Operation Warp Speed, which was particularly important because it provided funding for research, provided funding for advanced market commitments. And one of the reasons why vaccines take so long to develop, especially even for academics, is because they have to apply for funding constantly to get their research to keep going. And there's all other kinds of timelines that are impacted by that need for things like that need for funding that make this make it a longer process. And it's, I think you can't underestimate how much that speed was influenced by the fact that there was just money poured into this right from the start, particularly from the federal government. And one of the other key uses of a challenge study, in addition to sort of condensing some of the research process for allowing you to forgo some of the proof of concept phases, is one of the ideas was that a challenge study, if you had early data that your vaccine was going to be successful, you could start manufacturing early. And with the federal government making these investments, that wasn't an issue. They were going to start manufacturing, at the start, no matter what. So pretty quickly, again, you're foregoing some of the proof of concept phases by moving so quickly, by having these things, sort of knowing so much already about the vaccines and about the virus, and you're not worried about early manufacturing. So some of the obstacles that a challenge study could have overcome were already sort of not issues, or were not issues in the same way when we get already to sort of April and May. So I think April and May is really when the conversation is most heated about challenge studies. And then already you start having good data coming out of the Moderna studies in particular, showing that this is producing a robust antibody response. And so again, particularly, I think folks at Moderna, folks at the NIH were very optimistic very early, perhaps naively so, that their vaccine was going to work. And so I think some of what the reason they soured so quickly on the idea of challenge studies beyond the ethical considerations was that they were very confident, perhaps overly so, that their vaccine was going to work. And so, yeah, there's lots of counterfactuals mixed in here, a lot of different expectations about what an emergency use authorization was going to look like, whether there should be one. It's actually pretty interesting to, looking back on, knowing how it turned out that the emergency use authorization happened and there wasn't a lot of debate over it in December. It's pretty interesting to go back and look over the course of the year about how many different ideas there were about how that should work, whether it should be narrowed down to to certain groups of people, how it should be rolled out. A lot of those things were not clear. We shouldn't take for granted that they would play out the way that they did. So there's some interesting research that I did, and there's more to be done, I think, about what the ideas were in early on of how this would play out and how Fauci's 12 to 18 month timeline was going to play out. I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions so far?
I had a question that was kind of related to the writing and the research portion of this. Was there anyone that you weren't able to get in contact with that you think really would have helped put this together in a different way or at a different voice?
Yeah, so I reached out to, I think, 40 or 50 different people, and I got responses from about half of them. It was about how it shook out. So skeptics were not eager to talk to me. There were some people like Myron Levine is somebody who I would have liked to talk to, who was very skeptical and was he would led the WHO's feasibility study. So he's somebody who I reached out to. I did talk to Anna Durbin, who was very useful. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people who were not interested in talking for one reason or another who would have been helpful. I could run down the list for you.
No, that's good. Thank you.
But yeah, and I didn't get to talk directly to anybody from Johnson & Johnson. I reached out to at least one of the people there, and they were not willing to talk. Were not interested in talking. That would have been very useful. I didn't reach out to Anthony Fauci. I thought about it. I didn't bother, but his perspective would have been useful. Not that he would have shared anything new. But yeah, so there was the people who did talk to me were mostly the people you would expect, were the people who were more enthusiastic about the idea. So definitely a lot of blind spots in that regard. Zachariah.
Thanks, Mabel. And it looks like you really did put in a lot of work on this one. And I'm kind of really excited to see what else is contained in the paper. But more to my question, you've mentioned speed as one of the advantages of potentially running a challenge study, especially in the pandemic setting. And so I'm just sort of thinking right now as you're speaking whether there was perhaps a workout, I don't know, mathematical workout you did to sort of ascertain by what margin the pandemic could have been extended as a result of non-use of challenge studies, as we observed in the pandemic. Do we have a concept of how long this pandemic has been extended because of not using challenge studies?
So I think some other people are thinking more about that in that quantitative way than I am. I mean, my real answer is I don't think that a challenge study, as things played out ultimately, I don't think a challenge study would have made a difference. And one reason I say that is just because the process went so fast to begin with. But the other big reason why I say that is because, the problem, I mean, to what degree has the problem been having the vaccine, and to what degree has it been how fast or slow we've actually vaccinated people and all of the people who have refused to get vaccinated? Again, there's this useful article by the guy whose name I can't remember, who talks about just that challenge studies, when we talk about the social value of a challenge study, it's not just getting a vaccine sooner, it's how much we can actually get people vaccinated. And the obstacles to that come down to things like like vaccine confidence, vaccine hesitance, and come down to things like these questions of distribution and having, the financial will and the, otherwise public health networks to actually get vaccines out to everybody who needs them. So I think that's sort of my answer, is that I'm not sure how much difference a challenge study could have made. And I'm also skeptical that it could have been, how much faster it could have been set up to begin with, which is one of the things that's, I think, also in the report and in my notes for this evening. Anything else before I move on?
All right. Thanks, Mabel, for that. So I do also agree that you've sort of brought in a very interesting point, with regard to the statement that, having a vaccine is not the same as having vaccinations. And especially you and I think, having done so much work around discussions of equity, I don't know to what extent equity, reinforces or takes away from this particular statement on the need, for vaccinations, even beyond the availability of a vaccine.
Yeah, definitely. And, in the article that I wrote that'll be out in the bioethics review eventually, I do talk about some of if a challenge study was used strategically, could it be used to develop vaccines that pharmaceutical companies are not going to? Could it have been used to develop a low-cost vaccine, a vaccine that wasn't patented, a vaccine that could be easily manufactured in the developing world? So I probably won't get into this too much this evening, but the fact that Johnson & Johnson was the company that was interested in and was moving most towards running challenge studies, and they stopped basically because it wasn't going to help them make any more money. They had, everything was set for them. The virus was circulating at high enough levels that they got results quickly. So they were able to, get their vaccine approved, distribute it, And well, they didn't make as much money as they'd hoped because there were some other snags to it. But what if, on a somewhat different timeline, you'd had the NIH setting up a challenge study and allowing somebody who would pledge not to patent their vaccine and to let it be developed and manufactured, in the developing world and distributed, exclusively there, or distributed, easily distributed kinds of vaccines. Could that have changed the equation? I'm not sure, but I think it's worth thinking about, about what kinds of vaccines could have been used in a challenge study, and how that would have played out as well in terms of some of these other questions about equity and about the uses of a challenge study, which again is sort of where we're going to end up in this conversation. All right, so in parallel, again, to all of this, is that public health response, the one that didn't work out so well, especially in the United States. One of the other key uses for a challenge study was going to be if there was waning of outbreaks, if there wasn't enough virus circulating to get results quickly, because the virus was under control but still a threat, then a challenge study would be useful in speeding up the process. So we're not waiting years and years for people to get infected by chance, but we could speed things up that way. Of course, in the United States in particular, but also in Europe and also in other parts of the world, the public health response was poor. Virus was circulating, at huge levels throughout the fall. And that was why we were able to get results so quickly, able to get that emergency use authorization so quickly. The phase 3 start at the end of August, at the end of July, results by early November, and the vaccines by December. So again, could a challenge study have sped things up? I'm a bit skeptical, but could one speed things up in the future? Could it be used in a strategic way in the future? I think there are some possibilities for that as well, that, again, I talk about more at length in the published article that'll be out eventually at some point. And of course, there's also this argument to make that I think is important, is that looking back, hindsight is 2020, but even with a phase 3 completed quickly, the vaccine could have been ineffective. It could have been ineffective in some populations more than others. And then what, right? So human challenge studies still could have been a tool, for a variety of reasons, in existing or alternate timelines. So they went unused, they were unneeded, again, but that's for these first generation vaccines. That's for this particular use that a lot of people had in mind of, speeding that first generation vaccine, rather than some of the other uses for which human challenge studies could have been valuable. So they were unused, unneeded, but they were to a greater or lesser degree prepared. So again, as I said, my task was really understanding more about the preparations rather than the ethical debate. And I think that understanding the sort of feasibility and the technical aspects is in some ways more important and even more consequential than looking at the ethical debates if we're thinking about why challenge studies were or were not run. And so One Day Sooner is an instructive example. Well, obviously the whole organization was founded to advocate for human challenge trial volunteers, and then ultimately sort of to advocate for human challenge trials. But quickly the challenge became not just advocating for volunteers, but how do we actually make this happen? And so I talk a lot about a lot of this stuff in the report because, I had a lot of conversations with Josh. He, sat down for interviews, sort of weekly for several months. But the problem that One Day Sooner came across was they wanted to do this, but then they had to figure out how to do this. And what you needed to manufacture the virus to a high standard. You needed facilities, and you needed expertise. And all were things that One Day Sooner sort of tried to put together and had some advantages towards doing, but ultimately some disadvantages, and sort of weren't quite capable of doing it, at least not the way, and at least not at the sort of scale and pace that other institutions could have. So again, this question becomes not just sort of who wants to run a challenge study, who wants to volunteer, but who's capable of doing this. And so several groups tried. Depending on how you count, you can count anywhere between like 4 and 7 or more, depending on whether you put them sort of discreetly or together. So the National Institutes of Health ultimately did manufacture a strain of the original strain of SARS-CoV-2. Theirs was finished, I think, early in 2021. Leiden University successfully manufactured a strain. That's Mette Rostenberg's team, and they did so in concert with Johnson & Johnson. So we can either count those two efforts sort of together or separately. Johnson & Johnson was the one that really wanted the challenge study to develop their vaccine, but Leiden were the ones who had the expertise and who were actually manufacturing the virus. And we're actually going to host that study and do the dosing study and sort of get things going. Then there was the UK Consortium, which are the ones that actually ran challenge studies starting in March of 2021, last year. And that consortium was in turn made up of folks from the UK government, from the Vaccine Task Force, folks at hVivo, which is the private contract research organization that specializes in challenge studies. There was a consortium within the consortium of academic institutions led by Imperial College. And then there was also the One Day Sooner effort, which in turn had various parties sort of involved at different phases. So there are a lot of different groups that were interested in this and were interested in different ways and came from different institutional backgrounds. So when we get back to this question of why each group did or did not run challenge studies, there's sort of two simple answers and there's a more complex answer. So the complex answer is this institutional answer, and that's the one that I really look at more extensively in the article, in the Bioethics Review article, that they all made different assessments about things like risk and benefit. Risk, in this, we're not talking just about the health of volunteers, the risk to volunteers, but the risk to one's reputation and the risk to public trust are two of the other really big factors that played into this decision-making beyond these sort of more utilitarian calculations that are compelling that we saw in the press a lot, especially. And then the benefit also was constructed differently by different groups, right? So there's this benefit of having vaccines, saving the world, ending the pandemic. And then there's also the benefit of making money, which was obviously a factor for Johnson & Johnson more than anyone else, but also for hVivo, it would have been a factor more than for other groups. So there's these assessments that folks made based on their sort of institutional locations, based on the specific risks and benefits that they would have faced sort of, on this much broader level, even than just that of the health of volunteers and the benefit of getting, of having a vaccine sooner. So that's sort of this big picture complex answer. And then there's also some simpler answers. So one answer why human challenge trials weren't run earlier in the pandemic was this question of feasibility. It's just hard to do. It's hard to manufacture a virus. Facilities are hard to come by. Expertise is hard to come by. So I know that One Day Sooner is working on some projects now towards developing some of that, having that capacity available, and certainly that's something that could change, how this plays out in another pandemic potentially. Collaboration is another really simple answer as to why things happened in the UK in a way that they didn't happen here. There were a lot of different parties involved and their interests kind of jived together with one another. hVivo was going to make money. There was going to be, other benefits for the academic researchers, and for the UK government, it was also appealing. They were eager to sort of take that step in the medical research space. And then the other simple answer, which I think is in some ways the central one, which is of course contingent on these other factors, is, as I said at the beginning, these different groups saw the uses of challenge studies differently. If you saw that the only use for a challenge study, the only thing that would make the risk worthwhile was speeding development of that first generation vaccine, then it makes more sense that it wouldn't be something you would pursue aggressively. It wouldn't, and you would look at it the way that folks like at the NIH and the way that folks at Johnson & Johnson did. If you're more concerned about, the obstacles to conventional trials, you're going to see them in another way. And then if, like the teams in the UK, particularly, teams at Imperial College, if you see the value of a challenge study as also being about learning more about the virus and about these longer term goals, then again, challenge studies are going to make a lot more sense. And you're, and I think that points a lot to why they ran them there and not elsewhere. It was just because they saw them as a different kind of tool. They saw them as a much broader tool for a much different kind of, means to a different kind of end. So yeah, I think that belief was really pivotal to why they ended up happening in the UK and to the information that we're seeing coming out of those studies already. So that's kind of what I have prepared now. Folks have more questions, happy to answer them. If not, if I covered everything, I got the whole picture. Needless to say, I'm also happy to answer questions offline. If you think of questions later on, happy to address those. And then we have discussed having sort of further events on some of the other topics. Things we've talked a little bit about, talking about some of these public engagement, public trust questions is one of those, is one of the things we might. You know, I think, so this question in the chat, what's the prediction of the future of challenge studies and future pandemics? I think the big takeaway, and, you know, this is, you know, an academic answer, it's, you know, not, this is something that Josh and I talked about a fair amount, was how, like, from an advocacy perspective, he wants a kind of urgency that, and almost a lack of nuance. You need sort of a lack of nuance to put forth a point. Whereas I'm more on the academic side of saying, well, it depends, you know, here's the answer, but this, that, and the other. So I think the big thing I came to about challenge studies is remembering that every virus is different. Every pandemic is going to be different. So this, you know, there could be a virus that is less, that is where challenge studies are a much more obvious answer, because we know more about the virus going into it. We, you know, have, it's less risky to a certain group of people. You know, there's all kinds of factors that could make a challenge study more useful in the next pandemic, or even more off the table in the next pandemic. So I think that was one of the things that I thought about a fair amount, was how, one of the reasons why the challenge study appeals for COVID-19 is that they're useful in a unique way for respiratory viruses, you know, because of the way that you can study, you know, if you get the flu, you don't know where you got it from, because of the way that it's dispersed through the air. So there's very specific uses as to why they were going to be had such potential for COVID-19 beyond just the vaccine factor. So I think that, yeah, the future of challenge studies depends a lot on what the next virus is, and how, you know, and how those how the details of that conversation play out. So yeah, not necessarily a satisfying answer, but I think that that's a big factor. Any other questions?
I'm curious how you, if you like thought that, this is like about your personal trajectory, were you already interested in like medical history when you started this project, or was this like kind of just serendipitous?
Largely serendipitous, but what I mean, the big picture thing that I'm interested in is like how we know what we know and how we think about the world, how we come to understand it. So I think that that sort of history of knowledge, I think, has something in common with challenge studies. There's a particular interest there that fits with those, broader interests in how we understand the world. I did have a background in the history of science to some extent, although I was working largely in 19th century natural history before I started this project. So yeah, a lot of it was serendipitous, was just having gotten involved with One Day Sooner. This emerged out of that, but I think it also does speak to questions of knowledge and experiences of the world that have commonalities with other things that I'm interested in.
Cool, and you say super interesting project. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. It's okay. You're interrupting my dad, so no worries.
Can you say something about how the risks to the control subjects played into this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a factor. The idea that, right, that you would be exposing people who, I mean, I think the big picture answer to that question is this general idea that challenge studies were had no benefit to the research subject is sort of the larger picture to that. The fact that specifically people who didn't have the vaccine were going to be deliberately exposed, that angle somehow was not the focus of the alarm, and it wasn't like the focus of the alarm in the ethical debates, at least not that stuck out to me. The bigger part of that debate was how does, and the thing that supporters drew out was how does this compare to other research that we do that doesn't benefit the research subject? So in that bigger picture way, right? So particularly, how do they compare to phase 1 studies that have no promise, that aren't going to do anything to help, somebody, you're just have the potential to inflict harm on them. That's where the comparison got drawn, more than concern about the people who were just guaranteed to get sick because they weren't even being exposed to the vaccine.
But was there discussion about the fact that, I mean, the risks were that you could die? I mean,
Yeah.
Usual risk is you could get sick, but here it was known that you could die.
I mean, you could get sick from an experimental phase 1 drug trial. You could die from those too. You get sick and die from those too. But yeah, I mean, that was a huge part of the debate was about the risk of death. And there's sort of 2 things to say to that. One is that even by the time those first proposals came out, one of the reasons why people went forward with them was because the first data came out of China in March that the risk of death to young people was under, I think it was under 0.03%. So when that data started to come out, a lot of people said, okay, this is more acceptable because we now know how low the risk is. And then when the UK study went forward, they found that the actual risk was like 1 in 250,000 of a healthy young person dying of the virus. So those concerns, and as many volunteers sort of, including myself, will tell you, is at least a lot of the one day sooner effective altruist type volunteers, tend to think about risk in very sort of antiseptic ways, very statistically thinking like, okay, well, the risk of 1 in 1,000 really is quite low. So I think that those ways of thinking about risk were also played into some of the ways people thought about it.
Thanks.
All right, so the UK challenge trials did not test a vaccine. Would the FDA US ethics ever allow a challenge trial to a vaccine group and a control group? So the big thing is that, right, the study the UK did, and I think this speaks to actually both to my dad's point as well, is the dosing study, which would have had to have been run in the US too, would never have, this is my understanding, would always have had to infect people without testing a vaccine. So the first stage of any challenge study is going to be finding the dosage that is going to reliably infect people so that you can do good science once you give people the vaccine or the placebo and then you expose them to the virus. So my understanding, and again, I think this is right, is that some of these details kind of got lost. Some of the most alarming details in some ways kind of got lost, is that the first stage to this whole thing was always going to not be about the vaccine yet. It was going to be about finding this dose. But the other important thing to point out is that in the UK, they did this dosing study. And so part of the point of that was to figure out how much virus to give people in an actual experiment, in an actual trial. But they also, of course, did all of this other research and found out all of this other information. And one of the things that Matt Memoli, I think, spoke to most incisively, but other researchers sort of pointed to a little more obliquely as well, is that's sort of the difference between academic challenge study researchers and industry ones, is that academics are very careful to make sure that they are collecting all of the data possible. So they're really making sure that the risk that volunteers are taking is taken advantage of, that they're really making that worthwhile. Whereas, to put it crassly, the pharmaceutical company just says, all right, tell us if our drug works. We don't need to know anything else. And so I think that is another, and again, I talk about this fairly extensively in some of the other writing, is that when we think about who was actually going to use a challenge study, the potential benefits matter as much as the risks. So the benefits to the NIH running a challenge study means we're going to get a lot of other different kinds of information, and they should be thinking that way if they're not putting that at the forefront. Whereas the biggest benefit for a pharmaceutical company, is the money that they're going to be getting back. So I think that's another important part of the equation. Any last questions? Yeah, I think a lot of this points to, some of the, when in the field that I come from in sort of cultural studies, cultural history, we talk a lot about discourse, talking about how people talk about something. So not just challenge studies do this, challenge studies could do that, but how do they get talked about? Well, various things come to the forefront more than others. And there's definitely a lot of details that, sort of get flattened out in a public debate like this, that hopefully policymakers are paying more attention to. Certainly researchers are paying more attention to, but it's always interesting to see what sort of gets the attention and what kind of, falls flat. And then you're like, wait, can we still come back to that? How does this other thing kind of fit in? Sometimes those things get lost. My big one that I wonder about is, what was Fauci thinking when he said that 12 to 18 month timeline? Because I don't think we know, like, the way that he was not predicting that things would play out the way that he did when he said that number. And so that's one of those things that, like, are there other ways we could have gotten to 11 months or 12 months into a vaccine? What are those kind of counterfactuals? One of which would have had to do with coordinating trials in a different way. There were proposals to actually run them much more closely together rather than sort of discreetly the way that they ultimately happened. And again, that's a way that perhaps you would get different data, perhaps you would get other kinds of information beyond just this big company's vaccine works and they're going to make billions of dollars. And we're going to end the pandemic, but also the money part.
All right, so I think if there aren't any other questions, we can get wrapped up here. Thank you so much, Mabel. Really enjoyed this and excited for the next several events that we host with this. Folks, if you do have any topics that you'd like us to kind of focus in on the next, I think we're going to do maybe 3 more events about this and kind of expand on some ideas that Mabel brought up and found in her research project. If you have anything that you want us to talk about, send me an email at events@onedaysooner.org. If you have any questions, if you'd like any further information, you can also reach out to Mabel. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Yeah.
So have a great evening, everyone. And thank you again to Mabel.
Yeah, thank you guys all for coming and for One Day Sooner for hosting.